are saying that China had floated a $1 trillion investment package into the U.S.
She's mentioned during her campaign that she would be open to renegotiating the free trade agreement, although there could be tensions around the $550 billion investment fund into the U.S.
What if Beijing just offered Donald Trump a $1 trillion deal? Not trade purchases, not tariff relief, but a massive Chinese investment package inside the United States. According to Bloomberg, that's exactly what's now being discussed behind closed doors. China is said to have proposed up to $1 trillion in investment in exchange for the United States easing restrictions on Chinese companies. Factories to be built on American soil, tariffs lowered on import components, and perhaps a historic reset between the world's two biggest economies. That truly would be a game changer between the two countries. And to understand the scale of what's unfolding, political theorist Graham Allison, the author of Destined for War, offers a useful lens. He warns that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, history shows that war follows in 3 out of 4 cases. And he calls it the Thucydides trap. But there's a best case scenario too, one in which both sides recognize that trap and deliberately choose to escape it. And that happens not through isolation, but through deep interdependence. A $1 trillion Chinese investment in the United States would be exactly that, a structural choice to make war irrational. In Allison's terms, this would mark the beginning of what is called the competitive coexistence. The two largest economies still rival each other in technology, influence, and ideology, but remain bound by mutual stakes too large to destroy. So these could be factories, data centers, industrial zones built with Chinese capital on US soil, which would make confrontation prohibitively costly for both. If realized, this deal could become the very embodiment of Allison's best case outcome. A cold peace built on fusion, not friendship. It wouldn't erase the rivalry, but it would channel that rivalry into a managed competition rather than open conflict, which is what we see today. In that sense, Beijing's $1 trillion offer isn't just an economic proposal. It's a geopolitical test of whether Washington and Beijing can rewrite history and finally prove that the Thucydides trap can be escaped. Now, there are many pro-China watchers who think that this is an unlikely possibility. There's no way that China would be talking about such an investment deal to benefit the United States. Why would China want to go down that route of humiliation like that we've seen happen with the Japanese and the South Korean deals with Donald Trump? Similarly, there are also many China hawks in the United States that would not allow such a deal to go through. They're itching for a war to take out China as a military threat, as they see it. Briefly, for Japan and South Korea, the recent US investment deals were seen at home as humiliating capitulations. In Tokyo, nearly $550 billion in Japanese funds will be committed to US-chosen projects, more than 10% of the country's GDP last year in 2024. Japan technically has the right to decline to fund all or part of the project chosen. But then the US can just impose tariffs on Japanese imports in response. So basically, there'll be little to no say for Japan over the projects, with Washington retaining control. And the profits will initially be split 50-50, but once Japan recoups its initial investment, 90% of the returns will then go to the United States. With South Korea, defense and chip agreements are being framed as partnerships, but once again effectively will force Korean firms to shift production and technology to US soil. Japan's new prime minister, expected by the end of the month, Takaichi, called the Iron Lady of Japan, which is a take on Lady Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, threatened during her campaign to reopen the trade negotiations with the US. South Korea is also pushing back now. Okay, so given all this, why would the world's second largest economy in nominal numbers and the first in PPP terms offer to put itself in a similar bind? Well, because it's not Japan and South Korea, and it will be negotiating the deal it wants, not what the US is going to impose. Second, The US still offers to the world one of the largest lucrative consumer markets that is desired by all countries for their exporters, including China. Third, China benefits from a competitive coexistence with the United States rather than outright hostility. This allows it to keep growing economically stronger, and remember, financial capital is always looking for diversified as well as good returns. If this happens, it would take China's investment policy in the US back to over a decade ago. The high point of Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States reached close to $60 billion in 2016, which then dwindled close to zero by the beginning of 2025. It's a reflection of the bad ties that started increasing tensions between the two countries. A similar picture to what we saw with the precipitous drop in Chinese holdings of the US Treasury bonds over the past decade as well. China went from being the largest holder of US Treasuries, holding over $1.3 trillion in 2013, to now around $730 billion. It now has the third largest country holdings after the United Kingdom, as fears of the US weaponization of the dollar led China to diversify away from the dollar, which has increasingly in turn brought up fears of de-dollarization for the United States itself. So let's dive in deeper into why and what China may be offering, and why Trump will be seriously tempted to take it up despite the China hawks and his team. The idea was first floated quietly in Madrid last month during the latest round of trade talks between the two countries. After months of tariff escalation and mutual accusations, Washington and Beijing reached a narrow framework agreement to keep TikTok operating in the United States, despite congressional efforts to ban it. Behind that breakthrough, however, something far larger was said to have been proposed by Chinese negotiators. A sweeping proposal which would open the United States to Chinese investment in return for tariff relief and looser restrictions. One insider told Bloomberg that China had floated the trillion-dollar figure as early as February 2025. Now, $1 trillions is not a number to be sniffed at. And according to that unknown insider, during President Xi and President Trump's call in which they discussed the TikTok deal, President Xi is said to have asked President Trump, and I would put quotation marks around asking, to create the conditions for Chinese enterprises to invest in the United States. No one knows how much is now on the table, but even half that amount would be unprecedented. Unsurprisingly, they believe that Trump, who has coerced allied nations to invest in the United States to bring back those lost manufacturing jobs, may be interested in this proposal. The president in a speech said last month, under 8 months of Trump, we've already secured commitments of $17 trillion coming in. There's never been any country that has done anything like that. The White House has said so far that the Japanese will invest around $550 billion. The European Union has committed $600 billion. The South Koreans are going to give $450 billion, although the South Koreans say $350 billion. The Saudis have committed $600 billion. The UAE, $1.4 trillion, and Qatar, $1.2 trillion over several years. To understand why Beijing may be making such an audacious offer, we have to rewind a few months. In April 2025, Trump reignited the old trade war with China amongst every other country in the world. He slapped new tariffs on all Chinese goods. At the time, Beijing immediately retaliated, hitting US farm products with 10 to 15% duties and other products. China's embassy warned bluntly on X later, if war is what the US wants, tariff, trade, or any other, we're ready to fight till the end. By June 2025, tempers flared again as Trump accused Beijing of violating a truce reached the previous month, with national security issues jumping in the US after China banned the export of several crucial rare earth minerals which are needed in industries from automakers to defense. China shot back later, saying that Washington was provoking a new economic and trade frictions. Now, behind the rhetoric and the chauvinism, both economies were hurting to different degrees. The US inflation has crept upwards, although maybe not as much as was expected yet. And while Chinese exports did slow sharply under sanctions to the United States, the supply chain rerouting has meant that they've started exporting elsewhere. However, a grand bargain is attractive for both sides. Trump's first-term deal-making focused on exports, soybeans, LNG, Boeing jets. The Phase 1 trade deal forced China to buy hundreds of billions of dollars in US goods, which never actually happened since the COVID pandemic hit, and then the re-election of President Biden meant that China didn't carry through on many of these agreements. So the first step is they want China to start honoring those agreements. So what is China set to be putting on the table? Well, Beijing's offering to invest directly in the United States to build manufacturing plants in the US in manufacturing zones, partnerships with American tech firms, amongst others. We can have joint oversight, according to the Chinese, like the TikTok model, EV batteries and chip facilities that would create American jobs, infrastructure co-funding from battery plants to data centers. Is there any doubt that Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, would not love to be part of such a deal? Definitely he would. However, the chances of the US allowing Chinese investment in some of these sensitive industries doesn't make sense. It's probably really low probability. On the other hand, manufacturing of low sensitivity goods, such as toys and furniture, the Chinese have a much greater chance of entry. Consumer electronics parts, maybe even solar panels, wind turbines, and green tech hardware, of which China is a world leader, and Trump is not interested at all in green technologies. Now, all of these fit Trump's Made in America agenda. They'll create jobs, and they can be framed as industrial partnerships, not strategic dependencies. China already dominates global supply chains in these sectors, so allowing the assembly or component manufacturing inside the United States could be politically palatable in the US if it's framed as bringing production back home under US regulation. Now, to make those projects viable, China wants tariffs lowered on imports. Think steel, semiconductors, and various electrical components and machine parts that all the factories that it's going to set up in the US would need. And possibly China would be interested in setting up and starting to work on a new bilateral investment treaty. The earlier one has been shelved since 2016. It's a strategy that turns Washington's own rhetoric on its head. Instead of bringing supply chains home from China, China is bringing its supply chains to the United States. For Trump, who's built his second-term narrative around reindustrializing America, that's got to be seriously tempting. And it wouldn't be difficult for him to sell that $1 trillion investment deal as a win for the US from China as a way of securing a level playing field for American companies, farmers, and workers. He says his goal with China is to, quote, frankly, and most importantly, to reach a big deal. That's what he wants with China. In exchange, China wants to lower those tariffs, as well as a few of those national security barriers under the Committee of Foreign Investment Review. And very importantly for China, an informal understanding with Washington that it will not escalate over Taiwan, a red line that Beijing insists cannot be crossed. Now, that last demand makes this not just an economic deal, but also a strategic test. Now, President Trump has no lost love for Taiwan. He said many times that the country needs to do more for its own security, stand on its own feet. But whether he'd be allowed to trade for a softer Taiwan posture for $1 trillion investment boom is another question. It may be a step too far, even for him. But leaving that aside, the geopolitical messaging from this $1 trillion deal would be unmistakable. If Washington accepts, the US and China move from decoupling to codependency. If it rejects, the divide hardens, and the world economy is going to split into those rival blocs that we're seeing. President Xi and President Trump are due to meet in Seoul at the end of this month during the APEC meeting, and this may become the agenda. If finalized, this would mark a complete reversal of the past decade. Chinese investment in America, which once peaked around $47–50 billion in 2016, before collapsing under bipartisan scrutiny. By mid-2025, it was just $2.1 billion, a 97% drop. And the reason? The Committee on Foreign Investment in the US began blocking deal after deal after deal, from Jack Ma buying the international payments company MoneyGram, to forcing another Chinese buyer of Grindr, the date site for LGBTQ people, to sell that back to a US owner. And they cited national security risks. Beijing's new offer would blow through those restrictions, effectively reopening the United States for Chinese capital for nearly the first time in nearly a decade. When President Trump took office again in January, he signed an executive order which was fast-tracking investments from unspecified allied and partner countries. In other words, expediting their CFIUS reviews as a way to accelerate the funding of US advanced technology and other businesses. He wanted to rebalance economic relations by attracting major investment flows to the US, and that's been a cornerstone of Trump's second-term trade strategy. Now, to put it into perspective, the EU's pledged $600 billion of US investments over the next several years. Japan's pledged $550 billion. If China brings in $1 trillion, that's serious money. It would even more importantly signal a different track for both countries' relations. Already, the proposal has sparked fierce debate in Washington. The Republican chair of the House Select Committee on China warned that China routinely cheats in its dealings with the US. We cannot allow those companies to gain more access to our economy. Meanwhile, Trump's former Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, called it a huge concession to Beijing, tantamount to the US joining the Belt and Road Initiative. Critics say that Chinese capital could buy strategic footholds across key sectors, from energy grids to AI infrastructure, which gives Beijing leverage over US technology and labor. The supporters, on the other hand, counter that the US can set its terms. It can keep that TikTok model, keep American control of operations while allowing Chinese funding. Now, under that structure, Beijing could invest without managing data or critical assets. However, for China, a real concern also exists that in a Russia sanction-like scenario, what would protect its investments in the United States? Tomorrow, another president could turn around and say, sell everything, or even worse, just take everything from Chinese companies using national security as a justification. Either way, the stakes are immense. For Trump, the decision is as political as it is economic. He ran on making the economy better, and so far Americans are not happy with his economic policies. Tariffs are starting to hit their pockets. $1 trillion Chinese investment boom could boost markets, create jobs, and hand him that election talking point and help the Republicans in their midterms, if nothing else. But the optics are dangerous for him as well. Hardliners will accuse him of selling out national security for short-term gains. But then rejecting it has its own risks. China's already building massive industrial zones in Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico as well. If Washington closes the door, those factories and the supply chains they attract will permanently carry on outside US borders. And Trump himself has publicly said, if someone wants to build in America, hire our people and pay our taxes, I'm listening. Now, the coming Trump-Xi summit in Seoul could decide whether that rhetoric becomes reality. And if this deal proceeds, it will redraw global investment flows. China's trade surplus, capital financing, US infrastructure, its technology powering American factories, reversing decades of decoupling, and it will reshape alliances. Europe and Japan, who've been long considered Washington's trusted investors, would be facing a new competitor with far deeper pockets. And at this point, the White House hasn't ruled anything out. Officials are insisting their focus remains on ensuring that Beijing abides by the Phase 1 deal. But behind the scenes, Trump's advisors are weighing the optics, the benefits, and the timing. A $1 trillion offer is hard to ignore, but so are the political costs. So negotiators are now drafting various scenarios. The first is, of course, have a limited investment corridor, which is restricted to non-sensitive sectors. That's likely to happen. A pilot program that may be modeled after that TikTok arrangement, or a grand bargain tied to a wider trade reset, potentially announced at that Seoul summit. Each path carries different risks. Each one could define US-China relations for the next decade. Will this be remembered as that deal that almost happened the moment the US and China stood on the brink of economic fusion and pulled back, or will they go ahead? Share with me your thoughts. I'm Najma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Have a great day.